terms of power, I would describe COVID as a stutter and a short-term impact, but I don't actually think it's going to have that big an impact on our overall business and our overall growth. I have no doubt that when we look back on 2020, we'll see a small dip in investment and perhaps some projects slowed. But everything I think that has been on the cards for some time will continue. It just might be a few months or quarters later than we expected.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academia from all over the world, and it will explore the hottest topics across the energy market. It'll be hosted by various experts from Aurora and will give a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And on the show today, we'll be discussing the energy transition globally with an investor who's literally pushing forward the energy transition across most of the world's continents, across a number of new technologies with billions of dollars of investment. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Riverstone partner, Chris Hunt. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, John. Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
Great. So by way of background, Chris's day job, I suppose, or his main role is that he's a partner at Riverstone, which is one of the world's largest, maybe the world's largest energy-focused private equity fund. And what Riverstone are doing, I mean, you're almost better off asking what Riverstone aren't doing. They're pushing, among their big projects at the moment, they're developing 1,000 megawatt wind farm in the US at present. Which market's that in, Chris, just out of interest?
Oh, that particular one's in Western United States, serving into California from outside California.
Okay, yeah. So wind in the US, biomass is a major business of Riverstone. They own a company called Enviva, to supply biomass pellets for combustion. They're focusing on Japan at the moment, which I suppose is one of those markets that's been in the process of liberalizing for a decade or two now and is making some progress. And in Japan, they're focused on wind and solar as well as biomass. He's also active in Latin America. And he's also, I suppose, Riverstone developing gas engines around the world to provide quick response and to keep the lights on. Chris has a number of other roles. I won't go into all of them, but he's on the board of NTR, which is one of Ireland's leading renewables developers. And he's also a professor of practice at Imperial College in London, teaching there. So he's very active across the whole sector. Before his current roles, he really is. I'm not sure I know anyone who's been in the renewables business longer than Chris. He was developing wind farms in the 80s. Before Riverstone, he ran the international power development businesses at BP and Enron. And perhaps from the Aurora perspective, because Aurora is an energy modeling company, Chris's most distinguished role was a long time in history where he actually started his career as an energy modeler. And I think there's probably, well, at least my personal view is there's no greater grounding for a career in electricity than starting off modeling power systems. Was it a good grounding, Chris?
Oh boy, I'm breaking out in hives thinking back on those days. It was a long time ago, and the computing power that existed back in the 1980s was nothing where it is today. So we would oftentimes write code by the day, and then we'd try to run it at night. And as soon as we'd hit run, we'd see the light flicker, and the city of DC would go dark for a minute. So this was way before my time, I'm afraid. But no, it was a good way to get a good grounding in the business and understand how markets work.
Yeah. You may be surprised at the number of parallels. In fact, at Aurora, we don't have minimum model runtime as an objective. We have an optimal runtime, and it's around about 12 hours or so, because the shorter the runtime, the more features you can then add to your more useful features you can add to your model. And I recall from a recent meeting, you said it's not just you, your family are doing modeling at the moment, or your son's modeling Texas or something like that.
Yeah, no, I've got 3 sons all doing computer science, and some of them are actually getting into modeling electricity markets. So it's the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
No. So excellent. So that's some background on Chris. I'd like to cover. I mean, given your broad interest, it'd be great to cover a number of topics. And I'd like, as we at least from the power sector perspective, start to emerge from COVID-19, understand what you think the biggest impacts of that have been on the industry. Where's that impacted your day to day the most?
Well, in terms of power, I would describe COVID as a stutter and a short-term impact, but I don't actually think it's going to have that big an impact on our overall business and our overall growth. I have no doubt that when we look back on 2020, we'll see a small dip in investment and perhaps some projects slowed, but everything I think that has been in planning and has been on the cards for some time will continue. It just might be a few months or quarters later than we expected. A lot of our projects, we literally plan for 5 or 6 years to get them from idea to execution, and losing a couple months usually doesn't really have that major an impact. We are seeing some things. Sometimes it's a bit harder to get some solar panels and a bit later to get some wind turbines, but by and large, we're still pushing forward, and I haven't seen really any critical projects die.
Does it at all change your view on long-term commodity markets? Still in most parts of the world, electricity projects, generation projects, the economics are determined by views on fossil fuel prices. Mm-hmm. Does it change your view of what the world looks like in 2030?
Well, we are a very disciplined investor. So when we build a project, we either have the output sold under a long-term agreement, or we're very convinced we're the low-cost supplier and would be the low-cost supplier under a range of circumstances. So we actually haven't been that injured. I think a lot of people who have entered the markets with a fair amount of merchant experience are finding that the prices can go down faster and further than they expected when they originally approved doing a project. So I think the people who were taking a strategy of playing the markets, I think, will probably have to sit back and question whether or not that was a wise choice. But for us, it really hasn't been a big impact.
Yeah. And the other one that seems to be creeping in is green stimulus. Mm-hmm. Are you getting a sense that government's keen to push for, to play a bigger role in, as Boris Johnson says, building back better in Europe?
Yeah, you've seen the EU, you've seen Germany, you've seen signs in Britain. I think there will be a fair amount in green and post-COVID stimulus plans. I have no doubt of that. I don't think as much is going to be spent on sort of the traditional wind and solar type projects as you would expect. I think we're starting to see more of the monies going towards increasing the pace of EV penetration and growth and increasing energy efficiency programs, things like that. So I think the stimulus is going to more be providing some help to some of the industries that aren't quite as established and moving on their own. I think the traditional wind and solar projects are going to continue just fine without much stimulus, frankly.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose one distinction I see a little bit is in the offshore space, where possibly the ambition rises. These still require support, and that might be one different area. Were there any lessons? I mean, you were around and watching the Obama stimulus in 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. Do you think there are any lessons for Europe from that period in the US?
I think the main message is that when you have a market that wants to grow, and I think that's certainly true of the renewable energy markets, market interruptions like COVID, get quickly forgotten. And a year from now, presuming COVID subsides and we're moving forward, I think this will be a blip that we don't think too much about.
Interesting. Yeah, it's I don't know. I don't know if Tesla was a beneficiary, but certainly some of Elon Musk's businesses. And you kind of look, at least I look back now, and wind in Texas and things like that. Look back at that period in the US and look now and say, well, that stimulus seems to, in some ways, have changed the. Who knows where Tesla would be right now, but it changed the energy landscape quite a bit.
Yeah, I guess what I'm seeing, because I represent obviously a lot of investors who are focused on the space, is I'm not seeing a lot of people pulling back from wanting to put money to work in renewable energy. In fact, on the contrary, I think I'm seeing more money interested in the space and wanting to go forward. And that money, is still there and still interested, and for well-structured projects, I don't see. I think we're going to be fine.
Interesting. I said in your bio you were developing wind projects in the 1980s. How did they work? So the costs were a lot higher. I mean, maybe you remember what the cost. I don't know if you can do the inflation adjustment, but presumably they were a lot more expensive. The turbines were different technology.
Yeah.
Who was paying for these things?
Oh boy, you're taking me way back. It was like the Wild West back in the 1980s. There were relatively few markets you could go to, but the one that I happened to be working in was California. And back in those days, there was a government program that said that all you had to do was go into your local utility company and sign a piece of paper, and they would give you a 20-year power purchase agreement.
And then they'd put it on the rate base or whatever it was for the consumers.
Exactly, they put it on the rate base, and there were different kinds of contracts you could do. And then the onus was on us as developers to figure out how to find the land and find a turbine that would work.
You talked about a 50 kilowatt turbine. Was it the same manufacturers back then as now? How did that, was there a first mover advantage there, or how did that industry evolve?
It's funny, I keep a number of T-shirts of now defunct wind turbine suppliers in my drawer. It's like a who's who of names you've never heard before. Over the years, we've seen a lot of people enter and exit the business. Vestas was around back then, and they bought up a lot of the smaller wind turbine manufacturers that were struggling. But no, back in the 80s, we had a whole bunch of names that you wouldn't even hear these days. U.S. Wind Power, Canatech, Zond, companies that were good for a while, but then the industry outgrew them. Interesting.
Now, the other sort of period of history I want to touch on briefly was BP and Beyond Petroleum. BP's I suppose first foray into renewable. So we're going back sort of 20 years now.
Yep.
What were you at BP at the time during this period?
I joined BP around 2001, which is when I moved to Europe, and at the time Lord Brown was the CEO, and he was one of the first to show the guts to talk about CO2 and the impact it would have on the planet. And so he was very much ahead of the game in terms of moving BP into a greener direction. And I remember one of the defining moments for us in that was we had a career day where we would sort of have these big halls where we would try to invite graduates to come in and talk them into joining BP, and we had different desks for downstream and upstream and technology and things like that. And then we had a desk for renewable energy where I sat, and around 2004, 2005, we just found ourselves inundated by young college graduates. And at that point in time, we realized that the tide was really turning, and the young hearts and minds were really interested in this. And that was one of the reasons why we decided to push BP in that direction.
I hear similar stories from the other side. Sort of recruiting at big oil and gas nowadays on campus is a combat sport in some ways. It's a challenge. What do you think? So I think when people reflect on that period for BP, they say, okay, it didn't work out. There was a hasty retreat.
Sure.
What do you think BP got right, and what do you think they got wrong about that period?
Well, that we could write a book on that, and in fact, I suspect that someday somebody will. Pre-2010 in renewable energy, it was early days still, and a lot of early investors struggled. And if you look at performance of the early stage PE funds or infrastructure funds in renewable energy, anything pre-2010 struggled. Anything post-2010 has been a big success. So I think it really was in part timing. But it was also, moving mines in a big oil company is not an easy thing. And I recall some of the early conversations in the boardrooms of BP. There were a lot of questions as to how we would get hearts and minds around embracing a lower carbon future. And surely people who had spent their careers, in upstream or refining, were very skeptical of what we were trying to do and how we would do it and why we'd do it. And there was by no means unanimity that it was the right thing to do back at that point in time. And so we had all sorts of things we wrestled with about, do you keep the business separate and have it have its own culture? Do you integrate it? Do you hire people from the outside with expertise in the industry, or do you try to repurpose oil and gas executives? And all those issues were hard. And sometimes being the first guy through the door, you get shot. And so, I think being first is not always best. And we wrestled with a lot of issues that I think are now being sort of to the benefit of all the oil companies who are going through it and turning to a greener future.
Yeah, and at least from the outside, it seems like, having been an early mover, BP's now been a later mover in this phase, which may be the right way to play it.
Yeah.
Okay, as you say, there's a lot more we could talk about there, but I want to start to talk about the role of private equity in energy. I suppose first question here is around, and this is more your activities. So you're in biomass in a big way. One question I have is, what was the UK's role in the development of this global pellet business? So I don't know. I know Drax got some big contracts. Basically probably saved that power station when you compare it to other coal plants in the UK. Was that small on a global scale? Did that play a role in seeding an industry and reducing costs? Should we be crowing about that the same way we crow about the British offshore industry, or is it a different story?
No, I actually think your question's spot on. It's a good story. I think Britain played a very key pivotal role in offshore wind and also on biomass. And I think the role Britain has played on biomass is unsung, and Britain doesn't get the credit that it deserves on this. You referenced Drax, which was at the time the largest coal plant in Europe and one of the largest in the world, and the UK put in place some policies that allowed not only Drax but other coal producers to transition away from coal and into biomass, and that led to what was in essence the creation of the biomass industry at scale. I mean, people had always done biomass projects, but the UK's program really put it on the map and really allowed the industry to mature to the point now where actually it's scaling well beyond Britain. So you see a lot of projects. We're doing supply to a lot of projects in continental Europe. Japan has taken off. There's a fair number of island projects that are critical to the island economies that they serve. And I think that all really fundamentally started in Britain, and Britain should be proud of it.
Interesting. Well, I suppose one of the issues, one of the things you hear commonly in the public debate around biomass is, how sustainable is it? I suppose, and again, I'm no expert on this, but there's the chopping down trees bit, and it seems sort of one challenge, and then there's the supply chain carbon emissions bit. If we're sourcing this from a long way away, how much energy we're actually using to get it to the place that we combust it. How justified are they? Yeah, and will that be an impediment for the industry going forward, do you think?
Well, no, it's a great question, and I wish more people would ask it, because as in all things, there are good ways to do things and bad ways to do things, and there are good operators and bad operators. And we, the company that Riverstone owns, is called Enviva Biomass. We believe strongly in trying to do what we can to make this as sustainable and environmentally friendly a business that we can do. And I know that Drax also has a similar viewpoints in some of their own interests as well. So, there are certain things that are done to ensure that when you remove a tree, you replace it with one or more new trees. Or, we're doing programs that, but for our involvement in our purchase of the wood and the fiber, many of these small forest tracts would not otherwise exist, and they'd be turned into parking lots and strip malls. So there is a lot of emphasis on trying to do this well. And as in any industry, if you do it poorly, there could be very disastrous consequences. But if you do it well, you can actually have a great environmental impact. And so I wish more people would ask the questions and focus on the issues, because that only prompts the industry to do better. And the same is true for wind and solar, by the way.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. And do you think when we talk about net zero carbon dispatchable technologies, How do you think about competition between, say, pellets, hydrogen, CCS as the dominant ones at the moment? And will they all
Yeah.
coexist? Does pellets have a natural kind of cost advantage? Uh,
Well,
yeah,
yeah. So I'm an all the above person in the
yeah.
sense I think we need all of them. And I think, we've proven through some of the work we've done over the last decade that biomass is something that can be done now at scale and on decent economics and good environmental performance. CCS, is still coming into its own. I mean, I remember we at BP, we started working on CCS back in 2004, 2005, and it takes decades for this technology and to develop and to get to the point where you can put it in at scale. So I'm personally of the belief that we have to be pushing the accelerator on all of these things because they're all going to have their time to come to fruition. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an either and.
Yeah. And it sounded like there's a bit of an option argument in there as well. Maybe not all of them will come along, but how lucky are we feeling at this point in time? So, I mean, would you be
Yes,
surprised if CCS didn't work out at scale?
I think there are going to be certain places where it's better than others. A lot of people
Yeah.
don't realize this, but there's a fair number of CCS projects in certain parts of the U.S. because there's a market driver or a geologic driver or a project driver that allows it to succeed. CCS won't be phenomenally successful everywhere in the world, but it will be successful in certain parts where you have all the elements needed to come together.
Yeah. Okay, good. So it was biomass on the PE approach to the power sector. One thing I hear about the oil majors is that how on earth, or at least before COVID-19 and the oil price crashes, how on earth am I going to justify an 8% IRR investment compared to drilling for oil with a mid-teens IRR? And that seemed to be a fundamental challenge for these businesses. I imagine you have a similar situation in PE. I mean, within PE, how do funds justify the power sector investment who are doing both compared to the oil and gas investment? What's the logic there that you see?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that I've been wrestling with for decades. Because as you say, at BP, it was always a conversation of why should I put in money into a lower returning wind or solar project when I can get a higher returning oil project. And if you actually study, the returns on energy projects over an extended period of time, you actually find out that the returns aren't as dissimilar as people think they are.
Interesting.
And at Imperial, actually, there was some research that came out just a few weeks ago in a paper that was written just a few weeks ago that actually shows over the last 5 or 6 years, returns have actually been better on renewable energy than they have on conventional energy. Some of that is related to the COVID impact, but some of it is broader market forces in general. And so, generally what you find is you are getting lower returns and more infrastructure-like returns on renewable energy projects, but your degree of failure is much, much lower. So lower risk, lower return.
Yeah.
And on oil, the corollary is, on some projects, you actually get a substantially higher return, but then for all of those projects, you have a couple projects that don't work out so well. So on balance, over an extended period of time, they're all not as dissimilar as otherwise might.
Interesting. And I suppose the ESG angle is also coming in perhaps justifying a lower return. Where do you think we are on ESG? Where do you think we're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time as someone who's raising capital for energy sector?
Yeah, so look, there is absolutely no question that ESG principles are influencing behavior. And it is top of mind on most of the larger investors, as it should be. And that is flowing through to investors like me and all firms, frankly. But I still think we're relatively early stages in terms of the implementation and measurement of it. I think a lot of people have done some great work around what is ESG and what should you be doing and what are guidelines and what type of reporting should you be doing. And we're all listening to that. But I don't think we've yet gotten to the point where it's biting as much as it will 5 years down the line. So I think the next several years are going to show which investors are taking it seriously and which investors are doing it with lip service only. And I think the capital is going to start flowing to those who take it seriously and can prove and demonstrate that they're proving it seriously with tangible actions and tangible results. Interestingly, the words the letters ESG, E is getting a bit more attention than the S and the G, but I think that'll equilibrate over time.
Okay, interesting. And I suppose that just on one aspect of that maturity point you make, which is the way we define, the way we define what is good ESG, and we see companies talking about scope 1 activities and scope 3 or emissions. Ones
Right.
that scope 1 are the easier ones. The ones that relate to activity, scope 3 are more embedded in products.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's a necessary condition for this to move forward, for us to get better at defining what is good? Do you think that's an achievable goal? And I suppose you talked about the S. I imagine definitions become even harder at that, with the S than with the E. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, there's some organizations like the UNPRI series. There's a number of organizations that are doing good work and trying to define principles and trying to define concrete ways to measure performance. But it's not an easy thing to do, because you're trying to measure performance across a pretty wide variety of products. Everything from making shampoo to making diesel fuel to going to a car. How do you equilibrate, and how do you sort of realistically and fairly measure who's doing a good job and who's doing a bad job? And like all things, it's going to take time. And what we're doing today, 5 years from now, is going to seem sophomoric and idiotic, but you have to go through the steps to get to the point where it's really well measured.
Yeah,
but if anything, we are headed the right direction. And if anything, I think we're going to see a lot more attention rather than less attention. And I think those of us who don't take it seriously are going to feel the consequences.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a promising message, I suppose, and reflects definitely the trajectory of the last 5 years. Great. So can we conclude? I always conclude these podcasts by asking about a few concepts in energy and asking whether you think they're overrated or underrated. The principle's a bit like anything's a good investment as long as the price is low enough, just about. So it's the same sort of concept, not asking if something's good or bad. Is it overrated or is it underrated? So I've got 4 concepts. The first concept is markets for electricity. So do you think the use of markets to work out what happens in an electricity system is overrated or underrated?
Interesting question. Look, I think that all of us who've been working on the development of renewable energy for the past 10 or 20 years have been operating with a lot of safety, because we could always build a project and sell all of our offtake, any power we generate under long-term agreements. And those days are done. Now it's all about the markets and selling on the open markets and doing a mix of short-term and long-term contracts. So, markets are it. And those companies that get their arms around how to behave in a competitive marketplace are the ones that are going to succeed and grow over the longer haul. Those that don't are going to become dinosaurs and disappear.
Okay, so underrated then, as the concept.
Okay.
Good. Okay, so next concept is policy risk for investors. Investors often say, I just need less policy risk, lower the cost of capital, it's good for consumers. Obviously, government values being able to change its mind because as the world changes, and also values not having things on their balance sheet. Do you think policy risk for investors as a concept is underrated or overrated?
I think that policy risk is a big deal, and it will always be a big deal. Governments come and governments go, and governments, as you know, reserve the right to change their mind. And even small adjustments by governments can have big impacts on investments. And so anybody investing in this space has to make sure that they understand the local policy impacts and things that are top of mind amongst the regulators and the politicians, because they will have a big impact. And that's never going to go away. This is a policy, anything in energy is a policy driven business.
Okay, so I'll underrate. Okay, very good. So vertical integration in electricity markets in Europe. We've seen it come. It looks like it's going a bit. Do you think it's overrated or underrated?
Overrated. I don't see a big deal on that.
Okay, interesting. Final concept is global renewables investors.
Yeah.
This is companies or investment funds that have portfolios that cover multiple markets. We're seeing utilities like RWE, like Ørsted, and other investors that are moving from a kind of one or a few country model to a multiple country model. Do you think that business model is overrated or underrated?
Look, I think a global perspective is important because some countries are going to go through periods of growth, whereas others go through contractions, and particularly in renewable growth. So it's important to be global in my particular perspective. But it's also important that people realize that everything in this business is local. So while you have to have a global perspective, you also got to be on the ground and in the details and part of the community you're working in.
Thanks. That's a great thought to end on. Global focus, but with local knowledge. So on that note, thanks very much for joining us, Chris, for sharing your wealth of expertise and for fitting us into your busy schedule. Really appreciate it.
Well, and a congrats to Aurora that you're doing this, but also just on the impact you as a company have made on a sector. You haven't been around for 30 years like some other companies, but you guys have made a big impact in a short period of time. So congratulations on that.
Thanks. Really appreciate that, Chris. Delighted to hear it. Okay. Goodbye.
All right.
That was Aurora's Chief Executive and Co-founder John Feddersen talking to Riverstone partner Chris Hunt. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.